recording now. So thank you all for being here. We're really excited to have this presentation on grant writing and grant making. And as I said, I think a lot of people here who have written grants for the CHNA or written other grants might have a lot of things to contribute to this discussion. But the idea was that we as a body, as a CHNA, our mission really has been to redistribute resources through the DPH's DON process, and DPH decided to change the process. So that's not really our role going forward into the future. But we want to make sure that groups who are our members, who've been active, who are doing great things to improve health outcomes in the community, still have the ability to sustain themselves. So that's why we brought Kate here today. And I think that's why it's important to hear from Jen about one of the grants that we were able to provide. So Jen, I'll turn it over to you and you can talk about the Soup Man project over at Independence Academy.
Hi, thank you for having me. I wrote the grant, I remember, during the dark days of the pandemic, and I felt it was pretty straightforward and just gathering information. And we received the grant, and that was last school year, and it was too difficult to gather in a group, touching objects and, so we did it I think the middle of October, we did it this year. And because COVID was still an issue, I purchased a lot of the toiletry items by myself. We still have more money to spend, and I hope to do that as a group project, but I purchased all the toiletry items myself at the Christmas tree shop and Ocean State Job Lot and the dollar store and that stuff. And I brought it all to school, and we packaged stuff together with the students. And we brought it to the Soup Man's warehouse. We were unable, because of COVID, to distribute with the Soup Man, but I hope that in the spring we might, if it's okay with the grant, I can ask now, if we work with Mutual Aid Brockton, which we just did something with on Friday, and spend probably the remainder of the money, and and it just kind of works out a little bit easier if we work with Mutual Aid Brockton, because it's very close. And we distributed on Friday, which had nothing to do with this grant, but we distributed on Friday to undocumented families. There were diapers, Lysol wipes, and what the heck did we have? Oh, soup. I did another fundraiser, and we donated frozen bags of soup. So that seemed more of a kind of payoff for our students, to work with them, because we did get to see only one family. And I kind of don't blame the undocumented families for not showing up, because they didn't know who we were, and they might not have completely trusted us, but they knew the people from Mutual Aid Brockton. So the Soup Man, back to the Soup Man with the grant that we had, he has a bus. He's out of West Bridgewater. He came into our school before COVID and spoke to the kids. And he started, I'm sure that some people here have heard of the Soup Man. He did start kind of in Brockton. He did have, and he'll tell you this himself, and you can look up his website. He lost his son to addiction, and he was going down a bad road, and he did not know what to do with himself. And he's like, I'm going to make a pot of soup, and I'm going to go into Brockton and see who wants Brockton. And I mean, it exploded from there. He got a huge grant from Robert Kraft, He has portable showers now. I know like different mayors of towns have contacted him. He's in Brockton. He does go up to Maine because that's where his son passed. I can't remember the name of the town, maybe Lewiston. He goes to Pawtucket, Rhode Island. He goes to Lowell. And you can look at his website. He's huge now. He has a warehouse in West Bridgewater, tons of volunteers. And his motto is just people helping people. Like he just, gives people the respect they deserve, and hands out warm soup, and grew into, he gets huge donations from Ocean State Job Lot of coats, mittens. They sometimes people drop off so much stuff. I've taken stuff from the warehouse and dropped it off at other agencies. So he's doing a great job. A lot of volunteers, and it's all just people just want to help people. And
Jen, sorry, but how many of your students participated in the project?
Probably 6 or 7.
Okay.
And so we put together the toiletry kits at school, and then we drove over to the warehouse and just dropped them off. Because of COVID, we were unable to get on the bus with the suit man, but he has said to students at our school, if you want to come with me on the bus, I'd love to have you.
Great.
But it's all scheduling, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I can't pull kids out of school for a whole day to drive to Pawtucket.
Right.
So yeah, it's been great. We really appreciate the grant, and it's been great for the students, great for the staff. It's been fun.
Awesome. Yeah, and if you have questions about the funds that are remaining, and just email Kim and we can work that out.
Excellent.
On our end.
Thank you.
Any questions for Jen? All right. Well, Jen, thank you so much, and we're glad you were able to finally, with some challenges and overcome some obstacles to make this project happen. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So Kate, you heard a little bit from folks on the call, and what we're looking for and what our level of experience is. So I will just kind of quickly go over these questions that Kate had sent, and kind of how we're thinking of framing this. Because as I said, we want folks to be able to compete for funding that is out there. And I think half the battle is knowing where the funds are and where to look. Mm-hmm. So we definitely wanted to highlight that, or make that a resource that folks can get from today's meeting. But so it's where do you search for funding? What aspects of a grant are helpful to understand? And some of the categories Kate mentioned were logic models, sustainability, need, reporting, and how does an organization assess whether they should apply for funding? So I won't get too far into the weeds with that, but Kate, I'm going to turn it over to you, and hopefully we'll generate some good questions as we go along. Thank you.
That sounds great. And I did a couple of slides, Mike. Do you want me to share my screen?
Oh, yeah. Yep, let me make sure. Yep, okay, you should be able to share now.
Okay, thank you. Yep, I can see it. And I'm just going to put this into sharing mode. Can you guys see that? The initial sort of, okay. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. As Mike said, my name is Kate Harrell. I have been writing grants now for almost 20 years in different capacities. I did grant writing for a consulting firm that I worked for. I left and started my own grant writing firm. And since that time, have been working as an attorney and doing grants as part of my legal practice. And I do a lot of federal, state, and private foundation funding. So just to give you guys an overview of grant funding, there are those 3 different streams. federal, state, and private foundation. I'm going to probably spend most of the time today talking about private foundation monies, but given the different sizes of the organizations and the different skill sets, probably those that have applied before, I know a few people mentioned they have, and then some people are smaller organizations that are just maybe starting their grant strategy. We'll cover all three streams. So the federal and state streams, I'm going to touch upon probably in a shorter amount of time, just because they are highly competitive, although more money. But there's a lot of federal and state money available right now, and I want to make sure people understand what's available. So for the federal funding stream, the best place that I can tell anybody to start to look for grants is through the actual federal agency websites. So each of the federal agencies has their own website, and each within that website has a grants tab. If you're looking for healthcare grants, you might go to the Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA.gov, and look for funding there. And they have a grants tab that talks a little bit about their funding process, but also lists out all of the funding opportunities. And I'm sorry, I should have said just a minute on logistics. If anybody has questions as we go, please feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your hand on Zoom. Happy to do it that way. And then if for any reason I don't get to your question while I'm talking, I certainly will get to it at the end of sort of the talk, and I can give you guys answers at that point. The other thing I wanted to mention, I will give to Mike and Kim a list of resources that I mentioned during the presentation, so you don't have to be feverishly writing down, you know, different resources. I'll make sure that you guys have the federal, state, and private foundation grant pieces that I mentioned. So just in terms of federal grants, as I mentioned, going to individual agencies is a great place to start to do some due diligence. There is a portal that many of you probably have seen called grants.gov. And although grants.gov is the search engine for all federal grants, it at times is overwhelming given the amount of information that's included. And if you're going to be looking for general grants, if you're searching for things like healthcare or substance use, transportation, social determinants of health, housing, you are going to put that in the search tool for grants.gov, and up is going to come about 10,000 responses. And so in getting all of those, one, a lot of them you won't want to apply for because they don't meet your needs. Two, you probably aren't going to be eligible for some of them. And then three, like I said, it's a little bit overwhelming. So going to the individual agencies to start your federal research is a great place to start. The reason why I'm going to spend a lot of my time on private foundation monies today is because if you're already applying for grants and you have some background there, I think it's wonderful to look at state and federal opportunities. If you have not applied for grants previously, a great way to start is to look at private foundation grants. They are a little bit less robust in the number of materials that you have to submit, and they're a little bit friendlier in that you can call a foundation project officer, introduce yourself, introduce your organization, have a conversation with them about your potential idea and if it actually meets the grant standards. And that's not usually the case for federal or state grants. For federal or state grants, they are highly competitive, meaning hundreds and thousands of applications for just one opportunity are going to go in. So if you go to a federal agency today, they might have 20 grants listed. For each of those grants, hundreds of people or thousands of people are going to be applying. So you have to be as competitive as possible. And the way you gain more competitive experience is to actually go through the grant process itself. And oftentimes that helps with private funders. And when I say highly competitive, a lot of folks ask me to sort of clarify what that means. Oftentimes, thousands of applications are going in for only 2 to maybe 10 awards. So on a regular basis, there is less than 1% of funding that is actually being given out to people. or excuse me, to organizations. So helpful to understand sort of the odds you're up against. That's not to discourage you from federal money. It's just to say you should know what you're getting into. Other things around federal deadlines, just to note, usually federal grants come out 2 to 3 months ahead of time before the due date. For a federal grant, you are going to need all of that time to apply. And the reason you need all of that time is there's numerous documents that must be submitted, including usually a grant narrative and a budget narrative. And those narratives have to touch upon all of the criteria that's listed in what's called a notice of funding opportunity, or the actual grant that's released from the federal agency. So making sure that you're giving yourself enough time. I've had folks come to me and say, there's only a week left. Do you think we can apply for this federal grant? No, not if you're going to do a good, thorough job and make sure that you put your best foot forward. But oftentimes federal grants are cyclical. So they're going to come around annually, or maybe or triannually. They'll be every 3 years coming out. And so you would have the opportunity to reapply. I know that's not great if it's not, annual and you're waiting 3 years, but it's also better to wait than to submit something that you don't think is the caliber that you would want it to be, because project officers, believe it or not, in agencies talk to each other. And if they receive something that they just think will not pass technical review, meaning they don't think you have all the materials you need to go forward to review, they will disqualify you. And no matter how much work you've done, it will sort of be for naught, if you will. So starting early, oftentimes, excuse me, for federal and state grants, creating sustainable partnerships is really helpful. So making sure that you're partnering with others in the community. There usually can only be one grant applicant, but you can share the money, and that you could be sub-awards to each other. There's a lot of sharing that goes on for federal grants. So thinking about who you might be able to partner with is also helpful. And then, as I said, all of your grant materials have to touch upon all of the criteria that's listed in a federal grant. So oftentimes there will be 4 or 5 sections that the federal agency says you have to respond to in the form of a narrative, and you're putting that narrative together and literally making sure you're telling the federal agency something about every single point that they're listing. And that, again, is what makes it more competitive, because the more experience your organization has with its main mission and main scope of practice, the better off you're going to be. So that's just a note about federal funds. Moving on to state funds, the best way to go about doing state grants is also researching them through a particular agency. So if you're a healthcare, provider or agency, or a small nonprofit doing healthcare work or housing, transportation, looking at the different state agencies to see what they put out. Another great thing is that federal and state agencies allow you to sign up for emails. I always encourage people to do that. Yes, you are going to get a lot of email in, so you might want to put in your personal email and not necessarily work. But at the same point, as soon as funding's available, they typically alert you that something's available. In terms of the state system, Combis is the state vendor, which a lot of you probably know, that lists out grants and bid solicitations. And you have to be a registered vendor, but you can just go on to this website that I've listed here. Again, I'll send that resource out. Get yourself registered for Combis, and there's a search tool there where you can also look for grants. Again, Combis, not the friendliest of search tools. So if you're thinking that you'd like to apply for some form of state funding, going to a state agency, looking up their grants information and finding out a little bit more is helpful before you go into Combis. Similar to federal funding, making sure that you're going to be competitive for the grant, you want to make sure you're the eligibility type. On federal and state grants, when you pull up the notice of funding opportunity, the grant itself, one of the first 2 pages is going to tell you who is eligible for the funding. You want to make sure that you're an eligible entity. Those are the initial hurdles you want to sort of check off to make sure you can go forward. Then once you do look at, am I eligible? How much money is there that I can gain from this grant? Does the federal government require me to match any of the money or to put any of my organization's own money in? Not free. It's pretty infrequent that there's matches nowadays for federal monies, but there are some grants I know through the USDA and other types of entities that are healthcare related. The USDA has a very large telemedicine program. And one of the things that you have to do for one of their large telemedicine grants is to have match money. They expect a 15% match. So thinking through all of those initial steps is helpful. And then looking at what the grant actually requires you to do would be the next step. And one of the things that they're asking you to do on a regular basis is, how are you showing impact? How are you evaluating your success? I'll go into those pieces a little bit more in a minute, but just want to sort of frame that that's what they're looking for. They're looking for you to tell them how you're going to implement a certain project, and then how you're going to be successful and how you're going to measure that success. So are there metrics potentially that you're using? Things like Mike just asked Jen, how many of your students actually participated in this program? That's a great way to show your impact. 7 of our students are actually working, with the Soup Man and doing those things. And showing that impact is going to make a funder want to give you money more, especially at the state and federal level. The more people you impact, obviously, the better off you are, but you want to be realistic with your expectations about, if you have 20 students, maybe half of them are going to be impacted by the grant. So you're being honest about what you think the impact really is. And then just moving down to private foundation monies. So I know Kathleen initially asked, is the Foundation Center, Foundation Directory, a good place to start your search for foundation grants? It is. Unfortunately, the Foundation Center is one of those places where you do have to pay a subscription service per month. But if you are or annually, if you are a nonprofit organization, it's my understanding it's a lot less, or a municipality, a state agency, anything along those lines, you're going to be paying less for that subscription. Other places to look beyond paid subscription services, if you will, is to actually look at websites. So Mike mentioned initially banks. Banks are a wonderful source for private foundation grants. I know the Rockland Trust, Eastern Bank, and Bank of America all have their own grant funding sections. The other thing just to mention is certain banks, like Bank of America, have what they call trust grants. And when you go on the Bank of America website, you can look up trusts, and then you can look up grants associated with trusts. You can put in the state, so you'd put in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, whatever you'd like it to be, and up will come a list of funders, their deadlines for grants, what they actually fund, and that will be available for you to look at. Once that's sort of the initial step though, once you kind of go into the websites and you say, okay, I'm going to take the Bacon Trust. They're a very large trust in Bank of America. I should say not large, but lengthy. They've been around for a number of years. They are a very big Cape and Islands and South Shore funder. It's the Charles Bacon Trust. And they fund things such as education, healthcare, some social determinant of health work, grants for older folks, so for senior programs, and it will list out all the information there. Not always, but oftentimes you then could type in Charles Bacon Trust and up will come their website and it will tell you what's available there. I don't believe actually the Bacon Trust has its own private website, but the next step would be for you to actually contact the program officer that's listed for that trust and have a conversation with them. Usually project officers are very willing to talk to you. They're either called project officers or program officers. They work with that grant trust or the grant foundation or whoever it might be. And oftentimes, I had a mentor once say to me, if you're submitting a grant and you haven't spoken to anybody, you failed, because that person on the other side of the application doesn't know anything about you. So one of the things to do is do your due diligence with private funders, get the initial report from whatever website you can. It might be the foundation directory. It might be a list of private funders that you find online. Googling South Shore, grant opportunities for whatever you're looking for is a great idea. Up will come other websites like Bank of America, like Eastern Bank. Eastern Bank, of course, has its own website that you can go into. They have different sections of funding, small and large grants. And so you go in, do your due diligence, make sure you're actually eligible. A project officer can't tell you whether something's definitely going to be funded or not, but a project officer can say to you, tell me a little bit about your organization. What are you guys looking to fund? You think you meet all of our criteria. That's great. What's your idea? You know what? We funded that last year, so we might not fund those same things again this year. Why don't you think a little bit more in this regard? And they might help you change your idea, get it more focused. They also might say to you, we have a distinct fund for what you're looking for. You're looking to do substance use work. We really recommend you apply out of this section of funding because there's more funding available there. So project officers, really helpful. I've never met a project officer that isn't willing to talk to you. Frequently, project officers will tell you what you're up against. So I once called the Amelia Peabody Foundation, and there's a trust in a foundation, and this was a few years ago, but they said to me, we are so overwhelmed right now with funding grant initiatives that are coming in. We only think 4% are going to be funded this year. So you may want to think about applying next year. They're very helpful in thinking through your idea, whether you're meeting criteria, and also what's going to be helpful for them in the grant application. Sometimes they say, make sure you're talking about, somebody asked that question about diversity. We respond well to diversity. Please let us know how diverse your board is or your employees are, anything along those lines. The other things just to know about private foundation streams of funding is that there's annual reporting you're going to have to do for all grants, federal, state, or private foundations. They require you to give an update, just like Jen just gave to the group, about what's happening with the money. And oftentimes it isn't joining a Zoom, it's basically just filling out a form or putting together a narrative that says, this is what we did with the money this year. That's all they're looking for. But they are looking to receive that information, and the more information you give to them about how well the funding worked and how good it was for your organization, the more likely you are to get a positive response, and also have the group come back. If you go back for additional funding in future years, they're going to tend to be more responsive because they're going to say, oh, I remember Jen, she gave that wonderful report about the Learning Academy and what they were able to spend the money on. I really felt like she followed up with us a lot, and that's helpful. And sorry, Jen, that I keep using you as my example. It's just helpful. And then financial management and reporting. So a question was asked about small groups applying for money. Oftentimes you will find that private funders, such as Fidelity, the Fidelity Foundation, they will ask outright what your operational budget is. If it's under $500,000, the likelihood of you getting a grant is much less. The reason is because they want to make sure that there's a sustainable organization that has financial management processes in place. Does that mean your small nonprofit that might have a $300,000 budget or $100,000 or less budget is not, able to have those same financial management processes? No, but they're looking to ensure that there's somebody watching over the money, like a chief financial officer or a program manager for the organization that's literally looking at the money, doing it in accrual accounting. So literally whenever money goes out, they know the exact place that that's going to. And also they want to make sure the organization's sustainable. So if you're a group that has a $200,000 budget as a nonprofit on an annual basis, and you're applying for $1 million grant, that's going to be harder to obtain because they're not sure you're able to manage that $1 million in funds, since you're used to only doing $200,000 in an operating budget. So just some things to be thoughtful about. That doesn't mean you shouldn't apply, because like I said, the more you apply for private foundation grants, the more experience you have, the more you're going to be successful for state and federal opportunities. I say this to you because sometimes it's a bar for submitting. They'll ask to see an annual report, and if it's less than what they're designating, they might not review your grant. You also can talk to the project officer about that. I've had a lot of conversations over the years with Fidelity about just that component. I have a nonprofit, they really need the money, they don't meet the operational budget piece. Sometimes foundations, not always, sometimes though, they're willing for you to write a narrative as to how you're going to manage the financial process so that they're not concerned about you having less of a budget. And also, when you call and you're actually talking to project officers, you create a long-term relationship between you, your organization, and the foundation. So like I said, I've called Fidelity a lot over the years. Even though the staff changes, the answers that you need are still going to be found with those individuals, and it just allows you to introduce your organization to them. It gives them a feel for what are the Plymouth Public Schools doing? What's going on with Healthy Plymouth? We funded them before and we gave them, you know, a small grant. Now we want to maybe do a bigger grant. So those are all things just to be thinking about for private foundation funding. I'm going to stop for a minute and just get out of my presentation mode and check to see if there's any questions that people have before I keep going into the next set of things. Did anybody want to ask a question, or do we feel safe? Keep going.
I don't see anyone hands up or anything in the chat, so maybe we should just plow ahead, Kate. Thank you.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. So then talking about the development of a grant program. So we talked a little bit about this already, but just to go through it more fully. Obviously, there's very different levels of resources available at organizations. I'm sure if you are like Louisa from Chenal 27 mentioned, she is going to be doing some grant writing for the organization now. If there's just one of you, or if there's a team of you, it's helpful to look at grant opportunities either bi-weekly or on a monthly basis. I know it's a lot because you have a lot probably going on in your everyday activities and your job that you have to do, but looking on every couple weeks or looking on a monthly basis about what might be out there for funding, either via federal agencies, state agencies, or through private foundation resources like the foundation directory, it allows you to understand when deadlines are coming up. So usually funder deadlines are very cyclical. They're the same time every year. So you can look at what are my first quarter deadlines? What might my second, third, and fourth quarter deadlines be? If I'm going to apply for 2 or 3 grants this year, or I'm going to apply for 12 grants this year, how do I space them out? What does that look like? Oftentimes, you are going to have to make materials that are specific to an actual funder's request. That's what makes you competitive. But you can certainly use language that you've put into other proposals and just recycle it and make it specific to the new funder as a way to actually cut down on some of the work that you have to do. So again, you want to answer every foundation's questions as written. You don't just want to copy and paste something, which I know you wouldn't do, but from a previous grant, but using some of the same language. Everyone's asking you about need. Everyone's asking you about how you're going to sustain. You already have your concepts down if you've done one initial grant application, so why not use that verbiage in other applications that you might need? Sometimes meeting weekly with the your organizational team. So if it's senior leadership, or you are the senior leader and you're talking to some of your employees, or if even there's only 1 or 2 of you, coming together and sort of saying, okay, this is what we need money for this year, looking at your strategic plan, looking at your strategic priorities. What do we think we can apply to grant money for? Maybe 20,000, maybe 100,000, maybe $1 million, whatever it might be for your organization. But do we know of opportunities that are coming up? Can we put them on the calendar? Do we know that there's going to be a potential foundation grant coming out from Rockland Trust or Fidelity, which again, their deadlines are pretty cyclical. They're the same each year. And if they're not, they notify you fairly early. So all of those things are helpful in thinking through how you're going to generate your grant program for the year. And again, that's you're applying for one grant or you're applying for 12 grants. The development of the proposals for specific grant opportunities, like I said, for every opportunity you to submit for, you have to have the specific materials the funder wants, especially a private foundation. But like I said, you can look for ways to recycle information so you're not starting from scratch on every single proposal. Literally, your 501c3 letter, oftentimes from the IRS, oftentimes your audited financials from the previous year are the two things that are always going to be required by any type of funder that you're submitting to. So having those in a location where you can just grab them, a shared folder or somewhere on your own desktop that they're easily accessed, great, just to make your life easier. And then I want to just make a mention of, you know, sort of the round peg and the square hole. I'm sorry, the round peg, square hole. And so oftentimes people will come and say, well, we meet half the criteria, but we don't meet the other half, but we really need the money. What do you think we should do? If you aren't meeting at least 90 to 95% of what a funder wants, the likelihood of you getting funding, not high. If you, if the Bacon Trust says we're looking for senior grants and you run a childcare program that's in need of money and you haven't spoken to a project officer about maybe submitting this grant, I would not go for that funding because you don't want to waste your resources and your incredibly valuable time on something that may not come to fruition. But calling the project officer saying, listen, we know Bacon Trust does, you know, senior grants, but we have this really great childcare program where we're trying to bring kids and seniors together. And so there's a senior component, but you know, we'd love it if elementary school kids, high school kids came over to the senior center and were able to interact, and we would get funding to basically pay for some of the activities that the group would do. All of those things are going to go into whether a project officer tells you to apply or not, and you meeting all the criteria for what you're going to implement is one of the greatest ways to make yourself as competitive as possible. And I will say to you, it won't be so burdensome when you do implement. So if you're checking all the boxes and saying, this is a great grant, there's seniors, there's kids, we're going to get our activities paid for, we need our activities paid for, it's $10,000 for those activities, and this is a $15,000 grant, so we might get a little overhead on there. I think all of those things are great in thinking that through. And I did just mention the word overhead, and I will just say something about that quickly. In terms of overhead, you want to be thinking about what does it actually cost your organization to do a grant, to actually implement it. A lot of times private funders will not allow you to submit for overhead costs. So things like your office space, turning your lights on, having a project manager there to actually implement the grant and make sure things are going smoothly. Oftentimes they won't pay for that, but oftentimes they will. And they will set a bar of 10% or 20%. And if the grant's $100,000, that then means you can keep that 20% to actually just go to your costs of running that program. And thinking through what those costs are can be really valuable to you for your sustainability. Very frequently I hear people say, oh my gosh, we got this $1 million federal grant, it's great, but we are spending $200,000 to implement this grant with all the people that are needed, all the equipment we had to buy, and it's really not that great for us. Looking at the return on investment and what your cost is for doing a grant is a really critical thing in the early stages to make sure you're not going to be expending too much before you actually can, you know, carry out the grant. Another question I'm frequently asked is, what if we get grant money but we decide we can't use it? I think Jen mentioned in her talk that they had to wait a year to use the funds because of COVID. very frequently private foundation funders, especially over the last 2 years, have been very gracious about grants and sort of saying, yes, we realize there's a pandemic happening, there's bad things happening. You can wait a year or two to use it, especially if it's a grant where people need to be in person with each other. These students needed to be with, you know, the group that they were working with. So before you think I don't know that we're going to be able to use it at this point, let's give it back. Always talk to a project officer. It is never great to give back money. If you're asked to give it back, you're asked to give it back. That's one thing. But if for any reason, and that's usually, not to scare anyone, usually funders never ask for money back unless they feel like there is something going on with the group that they've given the money to, and they want to understand if their money is really going to what you said it would go to. But for the most part, funders are very willing to say, take an extra 6 months, take an extra 3 months. It's all about that good communication with the private foundation. So thinking that through is really helpful. And before you make any decisions, talking through what your options are is also very helpful. So just to talk a little bit more too about some of the questions that were asked and meeting funder expectations, the best way for you to get more money from a specific funder that you've gotten money from either currently or in the past is, again, to make sure those open lines of communication are open, or excuse me, that they're there and you're talking it through with them. You're letting them know how helpful the funding was. You're sending them a card with pictures from the event and saying, thank you so much for the money. We just wanted to follow up after we sent in our narrative report to you that you required us to do, to say, hey, look at our kids like doing things, you know, with the Suit Man, or look at our kids being with these seniors, how valuable it is. Those little touches are things that funders really do remember, and that they want to work with you on. So they're more willing to work with you if you've already established that goodwill from the beginning. In terms of the diversity and inclusion question that was asked, it is asked so frequently now. And oftentimes, I know that others have said to me, we literally have to put in a box how many of our board members are, you know, what their gender is. Does anybody identify as LGBTQ? Does anybody identify as another race or ethnicity, or what races and ethnicities are people identifying? So the way that I sort of start to turn the tide on the diversity conversation, meaning thinking through as an organization, especially if you're smaller, how to become a more diverse group, especially in terms of either your board or your employees. And as you're explaining it to a funder, you can say, we've had, you know, you might say, listen, there's 5 employees. We all identify as white. We all identify as, you know, female, whatever it might be. But we recognize that other perspectives at the table are important. Talking about the recognition that diversity and inclusion are important, talking about the fact that you, even if you don't have a strategic plan, you can say, as a small organization, we're making diversity and inclusion a strategic priority. And the way that we're doing it is we have a 5-year plan, and we are trying to identify in year 1 a potential board member who identifies as a different race or ethnicity than our current board members, or something to that extent. Or, you know, if you are working in substance use, we're making sure so many of our board members actually may be individuals in recovery. We're making sure that people of all abilities are included. And so we are reserving a board spot for somebody, you know, that we don't currently have, but we know that valuable insight and their perspective are going to change the way we do grant making, or change the way that we lead the organization. Letting a foundation know, we know we're not there, but we're going to get there, is the best way to start to change that tide. You are going to have some funders that say, you are not diverse enough for us. Diversity and inclusion has become a very big conversation, especially over the last 48 months. And some funders, the new Commonwealth Fund in Boston, for example, And I say the new Commonwealth Fund because that's the fund for equity and diversity, different from the traditional Commonwealth Fund. That's one of the things that they look at. They are their board is primarily people of color, if not all people of color. They are looking to make sure health equity and BIPOC populations are, Black, Indigenous, people of color, that they are represented in organizations, not only on boards, but that the people you're going to be working with through the grant are also meeting those criteria. So letting them know that you might not be where you want to be right now, but you're headed in that direction is helpful. Talking to project officers and saying, we know you're asking about this diversity question. We know you want some good information, but we're just not sure how we can meet the standard. They'll be helpful in thinking that through with you. But I definitely think documenting, saying to the project officer, there's no place where we can really add any sentiments about anything in your application. Could we do an appendix? Could we do just a little narrative and write a paragraph about where we are and where we're going for diversity inclusion is always helpful. Sustainability is one of those other questions that I get every day, all day, in terms of, so we have this grant money, or we're trying to get this grant money, but in order to sustain the grant money, we need more grant money. How do we basically deal with that issue? And oftentimes, what I say to people is be very honest in your application. Say that you're an organization that has an operating budget of X. You're very well financially managed, and you can talk about the processes. We have a CFO. We have things that are we have financials that are audited every year. Our CEO is constantly in touch with the board about what the financials look like. All of those kinds of things are helpful in sustainability discussions, but you might have to say, in order to sustain this program, we would need additional grant funds. And so because we need additional grant funds, the search for those starts today while we're actually submitting this application to you. Or once we have the money, we're grateful for your money. We've now started sustainability conversations with other foundations, sometimes listing the number. We've reached out to 5 other foundations and are talking to project officers about how we might obtain grant funds from them to sustain the program you're looking for. That's always helpful. And also sometimes you don't need to sustain the project. You might say, this is a project that we needed to implement. We wanted those kids and seniors to be together to see what the activities were. We do think we want to keep it going. And we think from learning best practices, there's a way we could be more efficient and cut costs. But now we're starting to look at what other monies might be available, both in our own operating budget, because it's always helpful for them to know you have skin in the game or that you're being self-reflective and saying, okay, of our $200,000 budget, we might be able to put $4,000 or $5,000 towards this. I totally recognize that's probably not the case most of the time, but just in case it is, we have $2,500 set aside. We're asking you for $10,000. We have a 25% match there. That's how we're trying to sustain. All of those things really helpful for a funder. And then I know we touched upon this previously, but showing impact through evaluation is critical. So evaluation does not have to be that you've hired, a third-party evaluator to come in that knows, the economics of the situation or how to put together outcome metrics. Really, you can be thoughtful about your evaluation and say, how many people have I touched with this grant? How many programs have I run? How many children, adults, seniors have participated in those programs? Is there anecdotal information? So-and-so shared with me that her grandson is now volunteering at the senior center with seniors and he loves it. And he's thinking, now about maybe a career path that's a different choice than he previously was. Anecdotal information coupled with real numbers and real data, how many people you're actually impacting, 20 seniors, 10 high school students through 5 programs. All of those things are showing the success of your program. If you've had challenges in a program, helpful to call them out. You know, we didn't realize that getting transportation from the school to the senior center, which I know isn't really a factor, but we didn't realize how much money that was going to be. We've learned the lesson. We need to put in $800 for travel in our next grant, something along those lines. Those funders want to know not only what you succeeded in, but the lessons you've learned from maybe the challenges you faced, and that makes you more competitive as well. So I think all of those pieces are good. And I know we touched upon the small nonprofit organization piece earlier, but I think the more as a small organization, you start to connect with funders, connect with other community groups. Community groups are definitely a wonderful way, partnerships with them to understand what funding is available. How are we going to be able to get additional dollars for our housing project? And maybe somebody is a very well experienced housing advocate, and they do a lot of that work, and they say, oh, the hospital has funding, or Eastern Bank has money for that. Have you thought about applying? Sharing those types of discussions and synergies. We got a grant last year. We're ineligible to apply this year because the funder has a wait out period of a year after you've been funded, but you should apply. Those are the types of conversations that are always helpful with other partners in the community, or people that just have had experiences that you might not have yet.
Kate, I'm just going to note, we do have a question. I know a lot, we usually, we're going to keep going, but I want to get this question in. I'm not sure if Ann is still on, Ann Burke, but her question was, if the organization has a fiscal sponsor, how does that affect applying for a private grant?
So it usually does not really impact it too much. There will be a section on the application that asks if you have a fiscal sponsor. You would check yes and then provide the fiscal agent. Almost always they're going to ask, what is the experience of your fiscal sponsor, which frequently fiscal sponsors have that all set up. So they basically have audited financials that they can show of their own organization, but they also probably have a paragraph that says, we are the fiscal sponsor for 4 organizations. We've been doing it for 20 years. We have managed $500,000 in grant applications, and we are very willing and able to use our financial processes to do that for this organization. And it just talks a little bit about the management processes, how long they've been doing it, and what it looks like. It's very rare that having a fiscal sponsor is a bar to any grant application. I have seen once or twice funders say, and sometimes it's federal funders in all honesty, and sometimes it can be private foundation funders, we would rather you not have a fiscal sponsor. But they say we would rather you not that it's a bar to submission. At that point, if you see that, it's a good idea to call the foundation, talk to that project officer and say, we do have a fiscal sponsor. Can you tell me what's going to make me what's going to be helpful for me to include in our grant package to make me more competitive? And a fiscal sponsor, I'm sure most people know, but if you don't, it's basically somebody that just manages that grant money for you. Sometimes they are paid to manage that grant money, a certain percent of funds, which is why grant organizations want to know if you have a fiscal sponsor. It costs that organization money to manage your money. And so because of that, they might charge 10% of a grant, 1% of a grant. Frequently, organizations will charge that percentage just to make up their own costs, but they are not making money on it.
Yeah, I think a lot of our members, this is anecdotal, but I think there's some hesitancy or fear about the 501c3 process and the reporting. So it's an easier path for them if they do have grants or whatever funding they have to use a fiscal sponsor. So I think this scenario would apply to a lot of our members.
Okay, and like I said, should not be a bar in any way from you applying for any of these monies. Oftentimes it's helpful for somebody to understand that, for a foundation board and project officers to understand there are people that are managing this money that have a lot of experience managing it. There's an entity that has 501c3 status where it's a non-issue around eligibility, and they know how to do, you know, nonprofit financial management. So I think if you need a fiscal sponsor, it's wonderful to have one so that you can start to apply for grants. But again, they may take monies both for cost and then maybe a little bit extra. And that's just the cost of them doing their business, having that person manage your money. Frequently I'm asked, why is the fiscal sponsor charging us? Because they have to have a person actually managing your money.
Right. So just a reminder, if folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand and we'll go from there.
That sounds great. And then financial management and reporting, we just talked a little bit about. If you have a fiscal sponsor, they're the ones that are going to produce your financial report for a grant. The financial report for a grant is literally just where the monies have gone to in terms of spending, and showing the complete allocation of funds that you've received all the monies from the organization, you've spent them all, and now you are just looking to report back to the agency on where they went. If you have a question about whether something's eligible or not, just like Jen was asking Mike at the beginning, always ask. It'll create a lot of goodwill between you and the project officer, and it will also make sure that you don't have sort of a headache when it comes down to any audits that might occur. Sometimes, especially on federal grants and state grants, there are sometimes grant audits that are conducted, and it's just by virtue of the Inspector General at the federal level has said, HRSA, go out and inspect X amount of grants per year to ensure that the money was going where it was supposed to. As long as your money was used for things that you said you were going to use them for, no issue at all. If you're on the fence about whether something could be covered, asking the project officer is just going to make your life easier, because then you have documentation that says the project officer said this was a good use of funds. I was being a good steward of those funds by literally checking to make sure it was okay. And your reports that you do on an annual basis are going to be the thing that you rely on if for any reason you are audited. So you can say, I filled that report out to the Fidelity Foundation. Here it is here. We have everything we need, kind of thing. Strategizing for the next funding opportunity, we've talked about a little bit, but it's sort of always there in the back of your mind. So I'm submitting this grant to South Shore Community Action Council, the Fidelity Foundation, whoever it might be. And I'm putting my best foot forward, giving them all the materials they need, making sure I'm answering all the questions in a sound way. And I'm updating them when I have to on my reports. If I'm going to be late, I ask for an extension. If I can, I'll submit things early. And then I'm saying to the funder, because a lot of times private funders have what they call sit out periods. Am I allowed to apply for funding? We're just coming to the end of our grant funding with you. Is there any sit out period for the foundation? Do I have to wait a year, 2 years? The longest I've ever seen is 3 years to sort of go back to you for more funding, or can I just apply annually for next year? I will tell you that that's a very good conversation to have with a project officer, because frequently they'll say, no, we're just annual and you can submit another grant. However, there are some foundations that have what they call sort of unspoken sit out periods. It's not in their grant materials, not on their website, but if you apply for the second year in a row, you definitely aren't going to get money if you got it in the prior year. So knowing that in general, the board does not like to fund 2 years in a row. So maybe going on the 2 years after you've received funding is a better chance for you. You'll know that, and then you can put in your efforts, accordingly. So I will stop sharing my screen and make sure that this presentation goes out to Mike and Kim, and also the list of resources. But just want to check to see if others have questions and spend the last 10 or so minutes answering anything.
Mary Ann?
Yeah, I have something for Ann. I mean, I'm on a board that's a volunteer board for the Plymouth Center for Active Living, and that's a town organization. So they have a fundraising group called the Friends. And I'm on the grant committee too, and most of the grants we apply for are 5013Cs. So I've established a relationship with the Friends, and we created a chart that tells us the cycles, who's responsible for it, and how much money's been awarded and what we've used it for. And I give it to the Friends treasurer. And then I expect for them to give me back what they have. So I know our money that's in their whole process is accounted for. That's very helpful. And then I go to their meetings to kind of keep up the relationship on that. I don't know if Ann is working for a town, what that is.
Thank you. I don't work for the town. And so this is the first year that we applied because I just created the fund last year and we did a fundraiser and we did get $1,000 donation, for lack of a better word, from Eastern Bank because they've helped fund our Transgender Day Remembrance vigil every year, and then they knew about the Cape and Islands Resource Fund. So this year was the first time that I applied for the grant. So yeah, we'll see. I asked for 5,000. I don't, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah,
Well,
and keep asking for. Keep asking the top that they have to give. Just ask for the top. Go for the top.
Right, that's pretty close to the top that they give for community grants that we fall under. And I was able to actually give a good scenario. We've already given out $3,500, not specifically to the people asking, but have paid for rent, have paid for car insurance, have made a car payment, bought someone an electric dryer, help people put oil in their, tank for, heating for the winter. I've done some gift cards for groceries, did a gift card for someone that wanted to get some books for their kids about them being non-binary. So yeah, so the more money we have, the more we can do. It's the only non-mainstream resource fund on the Cape and Islands for the trans community. And we obviously, if people here, I can put my email address in the chat. We would go off Cape also, but we just kind of kept it Cape and Islands because it just sounded good for the name. So, thank you.
The other thing, Ann, that I would just say is that you could potentially leverage the money that you have gotten, the $1,000 donation, if you will, or the potential $5,000 Eastern Bank grant with other potential banks. So reaching out and sort of saying, we know you have a $5,000 fund. We were able to obtain $1,000 or $2,000 from someone. We're trying to sort of leverage that money to obtain additional grant monies, and this is what we'd be able to do with it. I've seen that frequently work too, especially if it's $10,000 or below. There's usually some instances where you could leverage the dollars in that way.
Thank you. Yes, because I do intend to apply to a couple of other grants through the bank. So thanks for that tip.
That.
I just have one more thing to say for her too, and Kate mentioned it. We established relationships with Eastern, Rockland, and there was one other, right? And it was on age dementia, trying to make the town age dementia friendly. And we had them come in and we talked, and every one of them had a story. And we got the money we needed. But that's something, Ann, maybe invite them to come and talk to them. It's amazing how they have stories.
Right, and we're just a really grassroots small committee. There's only 7 of us on the committee, and although Nauset Interfaith Association is huge, and that's, compared to us, that's our fiscal sponsor. But I have a really good relationship with Eastern Bank because I've banked with them for a gazillion years, even before it was Eastern Bank. So that's been my in on that part. I don't bank with the other banks here on the Cape.
Well, and I think Mary Ann raises a really good point. Again, cultivating those relationships is so important. So she and the board that she's on had folks come in and meet with people and talk to them. And all of those things are really helpful, not just in building goodwill, but in actually having somebody who's making the decision about your grant realize, oh, this is the work that they do. Okay, I can see it firsthand. I can see where the money's going to. And I feel better about that. It just makes you a real organization versus somebody on paper that they don't really know.
No, I like that idea, and I will certainly talk to the committee about that and hopefully get some of the other banks to have someone come in and chat with us. Thanks.
You bet.
Anyone else have any questions, comments, thoughts? I actually have a kind of a question / comment, but we're definitely seeing more that funders, especially the state and the DPH and the health realm, looking for collaboration and looking for regional approaches. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Kate, or if that's been your impression as well.
Yes, very much. So partnerships are always a good thing, especially because you bring the value of both organizations to the table. If anyone's ever applied to the Boston Foundation, either with your current organization or previously, they literally force you the first time. They've said, we accept your letter of intent. They force you to meet with other potential grantees to see if there's partnership opportunities, because they feel like if there is, we want those synergies to be built at this initial meeting. So you literally sit in a room with all the other people who their letters of intent have been accepted by and say, well, what are you doing? You're doing housing, we're doing food. How could we potentially work together? I
Right.
feel like being in the community, asking a lot of questions. I ask a tremendous amount of questions, and I joke with people, it's not just because I'm a lawyer, it's more because I'm a grant writer. Grant writers ask a lot of questions. And so in asking those questions, just seeing, are there any synergies? Or saying, Mike, do you know anybody in town that does veterans pieces? We're starting to do veterans work. Or, Melissa, we know at Healthy Plymouth, you guys do so much a lot of student initiatives. How can I get involved with that? Because we're trying to do more housing with housing for kids that have housing insecurity. So I think being out in the community, asking those questions, getting connected to people who know different people through larger organizations. I know everybody on this call, I'm sure, is a connector. People that sort of are saying, yes, let me help you meet some, Kim from United Way, or, let me help you meet this other individual. All of that's very helpful. And your partnerships are going to make you more competitive, because then they know you can work with another group. If you can work with another group, you probably can work with them as a funder.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, Kate, thank you so much. This is a great presentation. We are recording this, and I know a few folks were very eager to find out when the recording would be available and the other materials. So we'll definitely get those out ASAP. So, Kate, if folks have follow-up questions for you, can they reach out to you as well?
Absolutely. When the presentation goes to Mike and Kim, my email and phone number are at the bottom. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Happy just to talk with you about funding sources that I've seen that might work for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right.
Yeah, I do have a few quick announcements. Folks should have seen an email from Kim over the last couple of weeks or month or so about the Health Literacy Awards. We are currently accepting nominations for the Health Literacy Awards. This will be our 4th annual Health Literacy Awards, I believe, with a little bit of a hiatus in 2020 because of COVID, but we were able to do it virtually last year, and fingers crossed, we're hoping to do it in person this June as part of our annual meeting. So do think about, Kim just put in the chat that the info is on our website, and the info is right there. Do think about folks who have done or are doing great stuff in the health literacy area, raising awareness about health literacy and different health concepts, making it easier for folks to overcome obstacles to health. those are the people we want to highlight. We want to hear about what they're doing, and we want to recognize it. So those are due the nominations are due April 29th. So you still have the better part of 2 months to get those into us. But please do take a moment to think about who would be good nominees for that. The other announcement I just want to make, last month, we heard our mini grant recipient, the Community Art Collaborative. Of course, I had it all geared up to go, and now I can't find it. But they are having an event on March 31st at the school office. Here we go. The public schools office on Lincoln Street. It's the grand unveiling of their Honeycomb project, which they talked about last month, which they used a mini grant from us to fund. And that's March 31st, it's a Friday at 4 o'clock. And I think, Kim, we posted that on Facebook and we've sent that out. So if folks are interested in attending that, please do, check out that information. Jen?
Where? What town is that in?
Yeah, it's in Plymouth. It's at the Plymouth Public Schools headquarters, 11 Lincoln Street, Plymouth, Mass. For folks who are aware of the old town hall, is the old Plymouth Town Hall. Now it's a public schools office. Are there any other announcements or upcoming programs? The Health Literacy Committee is working on a film club discussion around mindfulness. We think we've identified a movie that we can show as a stream for up to, I think it's 30 people through the Canopy app. So we'll be getting word out about that hopefully within the next few weeks, and really looking forward to holding an in-person discussion after folks have had a chance to see the movie. It's called, if you want to check it out on Canopy, it's called My Year of Living Mindfully. So we'll be more information about that over the next couple of weeks. Any other announcements? Jen?
I have one. So this is not an immediate need or anything like that, but we are working. I'm with the Alzheimer's Association, and June is Alzheimer's and Brain Health Awareness Month. So we are going to be creating a landing page with resources for displays for libraries to be able to put out. And they'll also have a request form that they can fill out if they would like some display items mailed out to them. There's no cost for this, but if you have any connections to any of your community libraries, I did put my email in the chat. If you want to forward that to me, I would love to be able to make sure that we're going to be putting out kind of a blanket email to libraries, but if people have a personal connection, that always helps.
So yeah, Jen, Tom Comiskey is the outreach librarian in Plymouth. I
Yes,
know you know him because he does the health
his
fair.
email. Yep.
Yeah. And actually, Sam was on this morning. She's the outreach librarian in Duxbury. This is her first meeting. I think she's no longer here, but if you want to forward anything to Kim or I, we can make sure that she gets it as well. Awesome. That's great. Any other announcements? I guess we should have done minutes, Kim. Is it too late to approve the minutes from last month?
Oh, yeah, the minutes. No, I don't think it's too late.
I know you all read the minutes. So do I have a motion to approve the minutes from the February general meeting? No one is bold enough to make that motion. Okay. Caitlin, thank you. Is there a second? Melissa,
It looks
I know you
like
want a
Vicky
second.
has her hand raised for it.
Oh, she
too.
does. Okay, I can't see Vicky. Thank you, Vicky. And second from Caitlin. Any discussion? All in favor? All opposed? Motion carries. See, this was easy. Robert's Rule of Order. It's Jackman's Rules of Order, just as good. All right. So I won't go through the painful gyrations of taking a motion to adjourn. We'll just say we're adjourning. Well, thank you to Kate and thank you to Jen for your presentation. And just say that our next meeting is on April 13th, which is a little bit later in the month, but it is the second Wednesday, which is our usual date. So I hope to see you all on April 13th, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Kate. Thanks,
Thank
Jen.
you.